The wind screamed across the taiga like a dying animal. Outside, the temperature was plummeting toward -55 degrees Celsius. The black blizzard was tearing the forest apart, snapping massive pines like brittle twigs in the suffocating white darkness. Yet, inside the small, isolated cabin, 28-year-old Anya sat in terrifying silence, wrapped only in a thin, woven shawl. She wasn't burning heavy logs. She wasn't boarding up her windows with thick timber. Instead, she sat calmly by the hearth, surrounded by hundreds of thin, pale sheets of dead tree skin. To the hardened trappers of the Siberian frontier, she was the grieving widow who had finally lost her mind. The taiga is a merciless judge, and they were certain the coming frost would be her executioner. For weeks, they had watched her with a mixture of pity and scorn. While the men of the village were breaking their backs, felling massive larches, reinforcing their heavy log walls against the impending winter, Anya was out in the biting frost, dragging a small wooden sled through the deep, dragging snow. She carried no heavy axe. She swung no great iron maul. She held only a small, curved skinning knife. With delicate, desperate precision, she was peeling the bark from the ancient silver birches. "She is decorating a tomb," the old hunters whispered around the tavern fire, laughing into their mugs of cheap, burning spirits. They pointed through the frosted glass at the distant, thin plume of smoke rising from her chimney. Tree skins cannot hold back the black wind. She will be a frozen statue by morning. They trusted only thickness, mass, dense, heavy wood stacked high to fight the bitter, biting cold. The idea of peeling away paper-thin layers of bark to wrap the inside of a cabin seemed utterly absurd. It was, they agreed, the frantic, nonsensical work of a woman, driven mad by grief and isolation. But Anya knew a secret that the lumberjacks did not. She remembered the ancient whispers of her ancestors, the old ways of surviving when the heavy wood froze straight through to the core. As the sky turned the color of bruised iron, and the first devastating howl of the black blizzard rattled the iron hinges of the village doors, the mockery slowly died away. The men huddled by their roaring stoves, watching in horror as the frost crept up the inside of their solid wooden walls. And across the ridge, Anya gently pressed another sheet of pale bark against her walls, waiting for the real cold to begin. The preparation did not begin with the arrival of the gray clouds. It began weeks earlier, when the sun was nothing more than a pale, heatless disk hanging low on the southern horizon. The air had already turned into a sharp blade, cutting into the lungs with every deep breath. Anya stood at the edge of the ancient birch grove, her hands buried deep within her wool mittens. The forest was dead silent, save for the rhythmic, metallic bite of axes echoing from the valley below where the village men labored. They were sweating through their heavy furs, straining their muscles to haul massive logs. Anya, however, moved like a ghost among the white trees. She approached a massive, straight-trunked silver birch. Her fingers, stiff from the creeping cold, reached out to touch the papery surface. To the untrained eye, it was just bark. To Anya, it was a shield. The bark was cold, yet it felt different than the frozen rock or the iron-hard larch wood. It had a strange, slightly greasy texture beneath the light coating of frost. This was the suberin, the natural, waxy barrier built by the tree itself to survive the relentless Siberian winters. She knew that inside this thin skin lay millions of microscopic air pockets, tiny chambers of dead space that refused to let heat pass through. The hunters saw only paper. She saw an army of invisible insulation cells. She drew her small, curved skinning knife from her belt. The metal was so cold, it threatened to stick to her skin if she grew careless. With a steady, practiced hand, she made a shallow, vertical slice down the northern side of the trunk. She had to be careful not to cut too deep, not to wound the living heartwood beneath. The knife made a soft, tearing hiss, a sound that felt dangerously loud in the quiet forest. She then inserted the blunt edge of the blade beneath the seam, gently prying the bark away from the wood. The tree gave up its skin with a wet, cracking groan. A massive, perfect sheet of birch bark, curling slightly at the edges, came free in her hands. It was remarkably light, yet it felt structural, tough, and entirely resistant to the dampness of the snow. She laid the sheet carefully upon her wooden sled. One sheet would not save her. 10 sheets would not save her. She needed hundreds. Every single layer would add another barrier against the monster that was brewing in the Arctic North. Her back ached as she knelt again and again in the powdery, waist-deep snow. The wind began to pick up, carrying the first stinging needles of ice that bit at the exposed skin around her eyes. Her fingers throbbed with a dull, heavy ache, and the breath crystallized into a thick white crust on her wool scarf. Yet, she did not stop. She moved from tree to tree, selecting only the mature birches, harvesting the thermal armor that nature had spent decades perfecting. As the afternoon light began to bleed out of the sky, turning the horizon a dark, ominous purple, the sled was piled high with the pale, curved scrolls. They stacked neatly, nested together like matching shields. Below in the valley, a team of hunters passed by, their horses straining against the weight of a single, massive pine log. They stopped, their breath rising in thick plumes as they looked at Anya's cargo. One of them, a broad-shouldered man named Boris, spat into the snow. "You still playing with kindling, widow?" he called out, his voice heavy with mockery. "That paper will burn in a flash, but it won't stop the deep freeze. You need wood that takes 2 men to lift if you want to see the spring." Anya looked at him, her dark eyes steady beneath her hood, but she said nothing. She simply took the leather strap of her sled and began the long, grueling haul back up the ridge to her cabin, leaving the men to their heavy timbers and their misplaced confidence. The interior of the cabin was a dim, freezing vault when Anya returned. The air inside felt heavy, stagnant, and laden with the sharp scent of old pine smoke and settling frost. The mud-chinked gaps between the log walls were holding for now, but she could feel the subtle, invisible draft pushing through the microscopic cracks. The heavy larches that formed the cabin's shell were dense, but density works both ways. Once the extreme cold penetrated the thick wood, the logs themselves would turn into blocks of solid ice, radiating freezing temperatures inward. Anya unburdened herself of the leather sled straps, her shoulders burning from the weight of the haul. She did not rest. She lit a single tallow candle, its small flame flickering against the darkness, and began the second phase of her defense. She brought the first bundle of birch bark inside. The sheets were stiff, frozen solid by the trek through the sub-zero air. If she tried to flatten them now, they would shatter like thin glass. Moving deliberately, she placed the curled scrolls near the hearth, letting the faint, residual warmth of the fading embers soften the suberin within the bark. Slowly, the waxy substance responded to the heat. The rigid, curled sheets began to relax, becoming pliable, leathery, and remarkably tough. The smell filled the cabin, a rich, earthy fragrance of damp earth, sweet birch oil, and ancient forest resin. It was the smell of survival. Anya picked up a large bone awl and a thick hank of twine made from split spruce roots. Her task was meticulous and maddeningly slow. She began to sew the individual sheets together, creating massive, double-layered thermal blankets. Her needle passed through the tough, leathery skin with a rhythmic, punctured click. Every stitch had to be precise. If the sheets were joined too loosely, the freezing air of the blizzard would find the gap and tear the envelope apart. She overlapped the edges by 3 inches, ensuring that the natural, microscopic air cells of one sheet covered the seams of the next. The skin of her fingers became raw, scraped by the rough, papery exterior and punctured occasionally by the sharp awl. Drops of her blood dotted the pale bark, freezing almost instantly into dark, tiny beads. Outside, the forest was changing. The daylight had completely evaporated, replaced by a suffocating, pitch-black night. The silence of the taiga was broken by a deep, low vibration, a bass note that resonated in the soles of her feet. It was the sound of the pressure dropping, the atmosphere collapsing under the weight of the oncoming Arctic front. Trees in the distance began to explode, their internal sap freezing so rapidly that the woods split with the sound of rifle shots. The village below was dark, save for the faint, orange squares of windows where the men were still desperately stoking their massive fires, burning through their winter wood supplies at a terrifying rate. They believed their thick walls would protect them. They did not understand that the cold was not a wall. It was a fluid, a creeping ghost that sought out every molecule of moisture to freeze. Anya ignored the distant explosions of the trees. She stood on a rough wooden bench, lifting the first massive sewn sheet of bark against the raw log wall near her bed. The wood of the cabin wall felt like a block of river ice against her knuckles. She began to fasten the bark envelope to the logs using small wooden pegs she had whittled by hand. Layer by layer, the pale, silver skin began to cover the dark, threatening timber. She was building a house within a house, a secret pocket of dead air that would soon face the ultimate test. The hours dissolved into the monotonous rhythm of her labor. By the time the second layer of the birch bark envelope was halfway secured, the cabin had grown so cold that her breath no longer drifted away as mist. It fell to the floor in a fine, glittering dust of ice crystals. Anya's forearms throbbed with a deep, muscular exhaustion. Lifting the heavy, stitched sheets above her head required every ounce of her remaining strength. The wood pegs resisted her small mallet, the frozen larch logs beneath ringing like cold iron with every strike. Yet, she persevered, overlapping the seams with absolute precision, creating a continuous, seamless skin that covered the entire northern wall, the direction from which the monster would strike. This was not merely decoration, as the village men had mocked. Anya was deliberately exploiting a fundamental principle of primitive physics that the hunters ignored. The massive logs of the cabin walls possessed high thermal mass, meaning they could store a large amount of energy. However, they were also excellent conductors of cold once the temperature differential became too extreme. The freezing outdoor air would steadily suck the heat out of the timber until the logs themselves reached sub-zero temperatures, turning the interior into a meat locker. The birch bark, conversely, possessed almost zero thermal mass, but functioned as a near-perfect barrier to conduction. By trapping a microscopic layer of dead air between the log wall and the flexible bark sheets, she was ensuring that her body heat would be reflected right back into the living space, rather than being drained away by the stone-cold wood. She began applying the second, alternating layer of bark over the first. The waxy suberin coating on the outer surface of the sheets served another critical purpose: waterproofing. When the blizzard struck, the fine, wind-driven snow would inevitably force its way through the microscopic fissures in the log mud chinking. If that snow melted against the inner walls, the resulting moisture would increase the thermal conductivity of the cabin by leaps and bounds, causing the heat to vanish instantly. The suberin barrier ensured that any invading moisture would simply bead up, freeze, and roll away, keeping the inner chamber bone dry. Anya worked by touch now, her single tallow candle sputtering and dying as a sudden, sharp draft whistled through the floorboards. The darkness became absolute, yet the structural layout of the bark skin was mapped perfectly in her mind. Outside, the low vibration had escalated into a terrifying, high-pitched shriek. The vanguard of the black blizzard had officially arrived. The wind slammed into the ridge with the force of a physical battering ram, causing the entire cabin to groan and shift on its stone foundations. In the valley below, the sudden drop in temperature was already wreaking havoc. Anya could hear the distant, frantic barking of sled dogs, followed by the faint, muffled shouts of the village men. Their heavy log walls were beginning to fail them. The frost was bridging the thick timber, turning the indoor air into an active freezer, despite the roaring fires. The hunters were likely throwing entire trees into their stoves, desperately trying to fight the conductive draw of the freezing walls, unaware that they were losing a war against basic thermodynamics. Anya drove the final wooden peg into the corner seam, sealing the thermal envelope around her small sleeping alcove. She crawled onto her narrow cot, pulling her wool shawl tight around her shoulders. The air right beside the bark wall felt remarkably different. It lacked the biting, predatory movement of the air in the center of the room. The trap was set. The ancient science of the taiga was locked in place. She closed her eyes in the freezing dark, listening to the fury of the storm as it prepared to unleash its absolute worst. The alcove was partially sealed, but Anya knew the lethal nature of the Siberian cold. It did not merely seep through the walls. It pressed down from above like a crushing physical weight. The roof of the cabin was constructed of thick, overlapping spruce planks, covered in a heavy layer of earth that was now frozen solid. Yet, heat is a desperate escape artist. Whatever marginal warmth her body produced would naturally rise, colliding with the freezing timber of the ceiling and vanishing instantly into the night sky. She could not stop yet. Her legs trembled, muscles screaming in protest from hours of grueling labor, but she forced herself back up from the cot. She dragged the last remaining bundle of thick, unstitched bark sheets toward the center of the room. The cabin felt like the interior of a submerged shipwreck, creaking, groaning, and shifting violently under the immense atmospheric pressure of the blizzard. Reaching above her head to staple the bark to the ceiling joists was an agonizing test of endurance. Her shoulders locked with sharp, biting cramps. The air near the roof was inexplicably colder, dropping a fine, continuous dusting of frost onto her face and eyelashes as she hammered the wooden pegs into the spruce beams. She was constructing a suspended canopy, a secondary ceiling floating just inches below the actual roof. This was the final, critical component of the thermal envelope. The logic was beautifully brutal. By trapping a thick pocket of dead air directly above her living space, the rising heat would hit the waterproof, waxy suberin of the bark and be trapped, continuously circulating within her small, sealed perimeter. She worked in absolute darkness now, relying entirely on the raw, numb sensation in her fingertips. The rough exterior of the bark scraped against her knuckles, but she ignored the sharp sting, weaving the spruce roots through the tough fibers to tie the canopy tight. As she secured the final sheet over her bed, the black blizzard struck the valley with catastrophic force. It was no longer a wind, it was a solid wall of kinetic energy and pulverized ice. The noise was deafening, a continuous demonic roar that drowned out the crack of splitting trees and the desperate howling of the village dogs. Through the tiny, frost-choked windowpane across the room, Anya caught a fleeting, terrifying glimpse of the settlement below. The village was being swallowed whole. The heavy, protective logs the men had sworn by were failing completely. She could see no light, no warmth. The massive fires they had built were likely consuming all the oxygen in their tightly shuttered cabins, drawing the freezing draft in through every microscopic chink in the mud. Their dense wooden walls, once frozen solid, were now acting as massive ice blocks, radiating negative temperatures directly into their homes. The hunters were trapped in deep freeze coffins of their own making. Anya dropped the wooden mallet. Her hands were bruised, her fingers stiff and curled like ancient talons. The physical preparation was finally complete. The massive, double-layered birch bark skin now covered the entire northern wall and the ceiling directly above her alcove. She retreated into her small, enclosed sanctuary, crawling beneath her thick woolen blankets. The air in the center of the cabin was dropping rapidly toward -40 degrees, but as she lay perfectly still, a strange, impossible phenomenon began to occur within her bark-lined cocoon. The heavy, biting edge of the frost stopped dead at the pale, leathery sheets. The agonizing waiting game had begun. The ultimate battle between the merciless Siberian elements and the ancient, forgotten science of the trees was about to be decided in the pitch-black heart of the storm. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the eye of the black blizzard settled directly over the ridge. The temperature outside plummeted to an unthinkable -55 degrees Celsius. At this extreme, reality began to warp. The air became thick, heavy, and toxic to the human lungs, freezing tissue on contact. Massive 100-year-old larches did not merely snap, they shattered like delicate crystal under the immense internal pressure of their own frozen moisture. In the valley below, the conventional defenses of the village collapsed entirely. The thick logs of the communal longhouse had frozen completely through to the core. The massive timbers were no longer a shield. They had become active conductors, aggressively drawing out whatever faint warmth remained and replacing it with a bone-crushing, radiant frost. The hunters' fires sputtered and died as the dense air choked the chimneys with thick plugs of solid ice. Inside Anya's cabin, the main room was a tomb of white ice. Frost thick as sheep's wool covered the floorboards and the uninsulated southern walls. But inside her tiny bark-lined alcove, a quiet miracle of ancient physics was taking place. The air remained perfectly, miraculously still. As Anya lay beneath her blankets, the heat radiating from her own body rose toward the low ceiling. In a standard cabin, that heat would have been immediately absorbed by the cold timber and lost to the Siberian night. Here, it struck the laminated sheets of silver birch bark. The waxy, waterproof suberin layer reflected the moisture of her breath away, while the millions of microscopic, dead air chambers trapped within the bark structure acted as a complete thermal dead end. The heat had nowhere to go. It was forced to stop, pooling around her body in a stable, life-saving envelope of stagnant warmth. The rustic physics were beautiful in their brutal simplicity. While the village men relied on thermal mass, believing that thick, heavy logs would fight off the cold by sheer weight, they had forgotten that mass eventually equalizes with the outside environment. Once a log gets cold, it stays cold for days. Anya's birch bark possessed virtually zero mass. It didn't try to store the cold, it simply blocked the conduction of energy entirely. The temperature differential between the inside of her bark cocoon and the frozen log wall just inches behind it was a staggering 70 degrees. The bark was doing what the thickest timber could never achieve. It was isolating her completely from the planetary freeze outside. She could hear the frost groaning against the outer side of the bark, a dull, thwarted scraping sound that could not penetrate the cellular armor of the trees. As the first gray, post-apocalyptic light of dawn filtered through the frozen air, the wind finally began to die down into a low, exhausted hiss. Anya pushed back her woolen blankets and stood up. The air in the center of the room was cold enough to turn water to ice instantly, but she was alive. Her limbs were nimble, her lungs were clear. She walked across the icy floorboards and forced open the heavy front door, which was blocked by a massive drift of fine, powdery snow. The landscape that greeted her was unrecognizable, a white, scarred wasteland under a pale, featureless sky. Down in the valley, a few shivering, frostbitten figures were beginning to crawl out of their dark cabins, their faces blackened by soot and their hands wrapped in bloody rags. They had survived, but only by burning their own furniture, their floorboards, and their tool handles in a desperate losing battle against the conductive cold of their walls. Boris, the hunter who had mocked her, stood in the snowdrifts, his heavy coat torn, staring up at the ridge. Through the thin morning mist, he saw Anya standing on her porch, completely unhurt, surrounded by the pale, silver skin of the birches. The mockery was dead. The insufferable arrogance of the frontier had been shattered by the quiet, undeniable triumph of the ancient ways. The silence that followed the black blizzard was absolute, a heavy, profound stillness that seemed to weigh down upon the entire Siberian frontier. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world stripped of its illusions. As Anya stood on her small wooden porch, looking down at the broken, shivering community below, the true lesson of the taiga became clear. Survival was never about conquering nature through brute force, heavy timber, or stubborn arrogance. It was about listening. It was about observing the quiet, elegant solutions that the earth had already perfected over thousands of winters, and having the humility to learn from them. The silver birches had stood in the biting frost for millennia, protecting their delicate inner life with nothing more than a few layers of papery skin and microscopic air. Anya reached out, her bare hand gently tracing the pale, leathery surface of the bark paneling beside her doorway. The material felt surprisingly warm to the touch, completely devoid of the icy, predatory bite of the raw logs. The ancient science of her ancestors had held the line between life and death. The hunters who had mocked her for peeling tree skins in the frost had been forced to burn their own homes from the inside out just to survive the night. They had trusted in the illusion of mass, while a lone widow, armed only with a small knife and the forgotten wisdom of the old ways, had turned a thin, fragile tree skin into an impenetrable thermal shield. The knowledge of the past was not a collection of primitive superstitions. It was a map of survival, written in the very textures of the natural world. The scars of that record-breaking winter would eventually heal, and the village would rebuild, but they would never look at the white birch forests the same way again. The old ways are often quiet, hidden beneath the surface of things we take for granted every single day. They are preserved not in heavy textbooks, but in the resilient spirits of those who refuse to forget. In every corner of the frozen world, our ancestors left behind these brilliant, elegant blueprints for enduring the impossible, waiting for us to look closer, to remember, and to understand. If you want to uncover more of these lost, forgotten secrets of ancient survival, and witness the incredible ways our ancestors outsmarted the most brutal elements on Earth, step inside our circle. Hit the subscribe button, turn on your notifications, and join us on our next journey into the deep, untold history of human resilience. The past is full of whispers. Don't let them fade into the wind.